Good morning. It's Richard Edelman from New York, and we are here today to present our fourth annual Trust at Work study. It is a special report of the Edelman Trust Barometer. There couldn't be a more important time to discuss the employees. We have activism from the right in the United States pushing companies back on DE&I, and we also have a rising tide of unions. So let's get into the data straight away. So first of all, we're in 8 countries. We've added one this year. We've talked to 8,000 people during the summer. And let's just go through a perspective of the study. So the first thing we found is that my employer is the most trusted institution, 15 points higher than business in general, far higher than government. The second thing that we found is that my employer media is the most trusted source of information because it's seen as objective. The third big finding over time is that the workplace functions as an island of civility. I would rather talk about difficult issues at work than anywhere else. It's arguably the safest place. And this year, we have made a very important finding that optimism about the future and about the economy is deeply linked to trust, and that my employer is the key to unlock that equation. So let's go right to the data. We continue to find that my employer is the most trusted institution. Again, significantly higher than any of the others, still 13 points higher than business in general, and 20 plus points higher than government or media. So this is a continuity over time. However, the lack of economic optimism is a big problem. It's undermining the motivation of the worker. Specifically, trust in institutions depends completely on economic optimism. For those people who see that they'll be better off in 5 years, there's 73% trust in the 4 major institutions of business, government, media, and NGOs. For those who don't believe in the optimistic view of the next 5 years, in fact, there's only 27% trust in institutions. So a gigantic difference. The optimism gap about the next 5 years between the executive class and the worker, the associates class, has spread substantially. You'll see that the gap has always existed, 26 points in 2019. However, today it is 39 points. Well, what's going on? Well, the executive class has risen in trust in institutions, and the associate class has declined in trust in institutions by 10 points over the last 5 years. So we are now left with a 39-point delta between the executives and the associates. Why does this matter? Why does this decline, particularly in associates, economic optimism matter? Let's get to it. I also want to show you specifically by institution how different trust is for the executive class and the associate class. The gap is actually highest for business, and it is significant also for NGOs, government, and media. The implications of this are stunning. The executive is 2.5 times more likely to trust the CEO to tell me the truth. Who does the associate trust? My coworker. So again, either trust for the executives is top down, for the associates, it's horizontal. Also, you'll see on the right-hand side that the executive believes that he or she has a lot of control over how AI affects my job. But only 22% of the workers believe that they have any control over the implementation of AI. That is a 3.5 times delta. As for how company transformations have gone, again, pretty high satisfaction for the executive class, 60%. For the associates, only 22%. So 2.5 times less likely to say their experience has been positive. On mental health, we find this same huge disparity. For the associates, they've had a rough COVID. They had to come to the workplace. They had to produce the meat or the cereal. Executives could work remote. So the result, here we are 2.5, 3 years later since the lockdowns, almost a 2-to-1 delta on how people are feeling. And it's particularly clear that there's a delta between developing markets and developed. You'll see on the left versus the right. Much worse in the developed markets. There's therefore a real problem of associates being willing to take on additional work. Only half the likelihood of associates wanting to take on additional work without additional pay, 62 versus 26. Economic optimism is a tangible. It unlocks trust and it unlocks employee engagement. We find on economic optimism, age is a key driver, not income. Look at the delta between the people who are 45 plus and those who are younger. The younger group is in the mid-60s on this belief in economic optimism. My family would be better off in 5 years. But for those 44 plus in age, deep concern, and probably because they've seen this play before. They are concerned about globalization. That caused big problems. Now they're concerned about AI. Interestingly, look on the far right of this chart. Not much difference politically. Look on the left-hand side, not much by gender, and even not much by income. With economic optimism, we see a big jump in discretionary effort and in motivation. So, in fact, optimism yields you tangible benefits as an employer. Also, we find with optimism, advocacy and loyalty increase. So, I'm prepared to recommend my organization, and I'm prepared to stay longer in my company if I feel good about my job prospects and therefore my economic prospects. Also, on implementation of AI, if I'm optimistic, I'm much, much more inclined to accept AI. If I'm pessimistic, if I'm a non-optimist, I'm inclined to reject AI. Also, take a look at the willingness of employees on being an external advocate. I am prepared to post content on my employer in social media once or more likely a week. I'm much more inclined to do so if I'm an optimist and to be positive about it. Sydney, over to you on how we're going to solve this.
Thank you, Richard. So while you see respondents clearly outline the gaps of economic optimism as defined by one simple question, when you think about your economic prospects for you and your family between now and 5 years from now, how do you feel? That was the question that helped us define this, by the way. So again, respondents clearly outlined the gap and optimism and trust in the workplace, but they also provided the steps to close the gap. So let's unpack those now. Next slide, please. So based on associate respondent data, this slide really sums up critical actions employers can take to close the optimism and trust gaps in these main categories of actions. 1, career pathing, or what I like to call sustainable employment. 2, providing impact via one's work. And 3, empowering employees with some sense of agency over their own employee experience. When this trifecta is actioned, associate optimism surges. And you've seen earlier in the slides Richard spoke to, but that elicits big benefits such as advocacy and loyalty and discretionary effort. So next slide, please. Let's do a double click down to understand the components of sustainable employment and career pathing. And let's start by defining sustainable employment. So the UK government recently defined sustainable employment as supporting people to stay in work and advance. Simple. In the US, interestingly, the National Institutes of Health believe that sustainable employment is a public health issue, and they define it this way. Sustainable employability commonly refers to the ability of employees to participate in work and the labor markets during their lifetime. And because this is so important for individuals, organization, and society, it deserves our attention at National Institutes of Health, because they say for individuals, work provides economic security and social ties, as well as informing this important part of and giving to their daily lives. Organizations need productive employees, obviously, for performance and to drive and survive market competition, but society needs as many people as possible to participate in the labor market to maintain economic welfare and social stability. So when you think about economic optimism, workplace optimism, beyond the basics of fair pay and safe workplace, respondents told us that these three elements are so critical. Continuous learning, show that you're willing to invest in my future-facing skills and enable my long-term development. Look at my ability to chart a career path. Be inclusive, have a diverse workplace, because that provides a sense of belonging. So this current backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion, those are causing some companies to rethink their commitments, and they are creating euphemisms for DEI. But according to our earlier Edelman Trust Barometer special report on business and racial justice, 64% of US respondents agree that organizations need to leverage DEI initiatives to improve business outcomes. And it's not a political agenda, it's a business concern as well as a social concern. Next slide. So here you see a force multiplier of economic optimism is trust. If employees feel trusted by their corporate leadership, they're much more likely to trust the higher ups in their organization. So look at the dramatic difference on the left side and the right. The employee trust levels soar when they feel executives trust them. It's literally this simple, as one of our panelists, who you'll hear from later today, likes to remind me. Trust is reciprocal, and an employer needs to proactively demonstrate trust in their people for their people to trust them. Next slide. In addition to sustainable employment and the proactive demonstration of trust in the workforce, employees not only want their voices heard, they want to have the ability to make an impact by giving input, sharing their opinions. They have a lot of knowledge on cultural, strategic, and operational elements in their organization. So increasingly, they expect agency over their employee experience and expect not only to have their voices heard, but to be involved in planning so that they can contribute bottoms-up insights to match top-down strategic planning. Next slide. So this is incontrovertible data. Employees expect their leaders to not only respect ideological diversity, but to entertain a wide variety of ideas and viewpoints, even if they differ from their leaders. Next slide. Over the past few years, this expectation for a job to provide the opportunity to make an impact through meaningful work and the opportunity to positively touch social problems has really stayed quite steady. It hovers at around 3/4 of the workforce. And next. So more incontrovertible data. Economic optimism boosts advocacy for your company's products and services. Finally, if we go to the last chapter here, what do workers want? They seek not only sustainable employment, but they want their employer to give them agency to affect change in the world as well as their organization. And we see this on the next slide. Across political divides, employees want their companies to represent and act on their values. And this demonstrates, they want them to demonstrate a commitment to address social issues. We asked employees whether they would be more or less likely to work for a company if it was to publicly demonstrate a commitment to these series of societal issues, and this is how they ranked them. Across nearly all issues, employees are far more likely to prefer companies that take action on issues such as health access, gender, racial equality, climate, labor rights, regardless whether they're politically left, right, or center. As you can see, there's less support for politically explicit actions such as political donations and a weaker consensus around LGBTQIA rights. But all the other issues measured really have strong support from employees across the political spectrum. Next slide. When we asked employees the series of questions you see here at left, many chose to work for companies that reflect their political views, but note the disparity between executives and the rest of the workforce on the right hand of this slide. Next slide. As respondents have told us very clearly over the past 4 years, employees still find communications from their employer the most trusted source of information in their life, even more than information from the government, traditional media, or their own social. So the opportunity for leaders to speak their truth to their people is very strong and worth the effort, because some workforce segments repost or publicly advocate on behalf of their employer more than once a week. Next slide. So the data also revealed this surprising statistic with economic optimism. When employers have done all they can in that recipe we just gave you to encourage economic optimism, involvement and civic attitude surge. So we at Edelman have long seen the data telling us that high levels of trust inside an organization radiate outwards from the workplace to the marketplace. This new insight on unlocking economic optimism it really positively impacts activity civically, and belief also shows that the employer can generate this impact from the inside out. So Richard, over to you to close us out with your conclusions, and then we'll move to Q&A.
So I think that all of you on the call are trying to evaluate what to recommend to your CEOs. And we have 4 specific ideas for you. First, we've identified the economic optimism gap, and we've tied it to trust. We need to show people, particularly those 40 plus age, that in fact, we can give them a better future in the next 5 years. Second, we need to be tangible about how to do that, and that is through upskilling, reskilling. 85% of people in our January study said they're scared about losing their job to AI. It's 5-1 in the United States against AI, about trust. Show people that, in fact, blue-collar jobs can be better jobs, better paid jobs, more important jobs, by using AI as opposed to replacing people, as happened in globalization. AI does not equal globalization. Third, this is about doing, not talking. Effective public relations means the do well expressed. And so we have got to move our companies to action, not simply words, because there's a huge degree of skepticism, not just in the workforce, but in the mass class divide. You see that, in fact, the people who are in the bottom quartile are angry and disaffected. Lastly, we have a chance as employers to make a huge difference in society. It will be much better for business because you're going to have advocacy, retention, positive word of mouth, but it also has the benefit, because business, and particularly my employer, are the most trusted institutions. Let's get this done. So we have a fantastic panel. Sydney's convened Now, Sydney, I'd like to pass it to you to introduce them. Thank you.
Well, I have the pleasure to introduce our moderator, who is the esteemed Isabel Burke. She is a workplace host of the Working It podcast. She addresses all things workplace on that incredible podcast, and she's been with the FT for quite a while looking at workplace issues, and I'm happy to call her a great thought partner. So Isabel, over to you to introduce the panel.
Sydney, thank you, and Richard, thank you. And hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to discuss some of the key takeaways from the report with our esteemed panel. But I'd like to ask all of you to get in and please ask Q&As, use the form. We'll try and incorporate as many as we can over the next half hour or so. We want this to be as interactive as possible. But I'm going to introduce the panel. Ali Goldsworthy is an author and she's a lecturer at the Leadership for Society program at Stanford University in California. Felicia Joy is Executive Vice President for Workplace Advisory at Edelman. Karen Reiter is SVP for Sustainability and ESG at the Adecco Group. And finally, Liebe Wenig-Rubenstein is Director of the Aspen Business Roundtable on Organised Labour at the Aspen Institute. And I'm absolutely delighted to be with everyone today. Just while you get ready with your Q&As, I'm going to direct my first question to Ali, actually. You know, you're an expert on polarization. You have written a book called Poles Apart that breaks down the contributing and intertwining elements that give this sort of us v them dichotomy, the binary that's in so many workplaces. And, you know, economic hard times is something that leads to a big sense of inequality, you know, something we've heard about. Given this new data about the gaping chasm between executives and associates when it comes to economic optimism, you know, what are some of the watch-outs that you would warn leaders to be aware of in organizations? What can you say to the audience today?
Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction. I think my first point would be that people lose faith in organizations and in institutions that they think aren't fair, which aren't playing by the rules. And I think that's, you know, there's a real risk that the polarization that we've seen in other parts of society begins to infect workplaces rather than that they stay protected. And as leaders, I would encourage people to think about how can they maintain or reduce that sense of us versus them within the workplace and stop it coming in. And there's a few things that hopefully will come onto in the questions, practical things they can do to try and reduce that. In terms of the broader economic outlook, those divides tend to worsen, particularly in times of rising inflation, which we've just experienced in many parts of the world, and rising unemployment. Those are the two big drivers that really can push it. So it may be that this is now at its peak and the external environment starts to reduce it, but people shouldn't assume that. And that will only happen if leaders take deliberate action to try and either protect their organization against the us v them divides, or, you know, like there's other external factors that help with it.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I just lost you there. Thank you, Ali. That's brilliant. And I wanted to bring in Felicia here from Edelman. You know, we're talking here about workforce optimism, and that's strongly tied to personal economic optimism. Could you describe for the viewers what workforce optimism actually is, you know, and why it's such a focal point for leaders at this moment?
Sure. Workforce optimism is about employees' beliefs about the future. And this doesn't necessarily stem from an emotional place. These are beliefs based on evidence that is in the environment. So this is an opportunity with the data that we're seeing for employers and leaders to create the conditions for increases in optimism. Because what makes up that workforce optimism and that belief in the future is people's belief in themselves and their own abilities. So employers have an opportunity to impact those abilities through the reskilling that Richard was talking about. It's about their belief in terms of workforce opportunities. So that gets to career pathing and planning, which other panelists will talk about. And then it also gets to a sense of control over their own careers. So what we're seeing very much in this data as well are these themes of power, control, and access. And employers can do a lot more in terms of clear communications and other actions, as Richard talked about, to give people that sense of control. We all have a need to be self-determined, and these data are telling us that people are really looking to partner, if possible, with their employer in their endeavor to be self-determined. And that increases that workforce optimism.
Thank you. That's really clear. And actually, that's a really good moment to bring in Karen, because you're head of sustainability at Adecco. How does, sustainability of employment and the kinds of things we're talking about here play into your ethos and your approach? What can you tell us about it?
I think essentially it's similar to what Sydney already said, and what the data shows is the fundamental recognition that we need to shift the emphasis from the resource piece to the human piece within HR, right? The recognition that employees are not just stakeholders of a business, but they actually are your business. It's not just a cost or sort of a discardable commodity, but it's a renewable asset. Essentially, it's about applying the principles of circularity to the world of work. So it's a set of principles that start with pre-employment. So how do employers also invest in the labor market before they bring employees on board? Working together with governments to say, what are the skills that we need? How do we lower barriers to access to the labor market to bring more of the under-recognized talent into it? Because it's not just about access to employment, but it's also access to livelihoods. And then it extends across the whole circle or value chain of employment. So what are the working conditions, the remuneration conditions? How do you enable employability across sort of the world of work? And as this is exposed to so many transitions, whether it's through climate change, AI, or automation, for me, it's also linked to tax practices. And yes, I said that out loud. I think that's a very important aspect of it. And then it also extends to post-employment. I think that is often underestimated. And you've just seen an example in the US where some of the workers found themselves locked out of their workplace. Their badges just didn't work anymore. So again, it goes back to how do we treat workers and how do we treat those that really contribute significantly to economic development and growth. So it's essentially, we talk a lot about planet positive, but that needs to go hand in hand with people positive so that ultimately we become humanity positive.
And I'd like to bring in Liebe. Actually, it follows on really nicely from that point about being people positive. The data suggests that employers are rebalancing their priorities away from employees. Given that employee activism and labour organising have been on the rise since the pandemic, do you think this shift in employers' priorities suggests employees will be less empowered to organise? How are you seeing it out there?
Thanks, Isabel, and thanks for having me, Edelman. The data obviously demonstrate this stark and increasing disconnect between corporate leadership and their frontline and associate workers. And this at a time where, if you look at the headlines, certainly you would forgive employees for believing that employers are focusing on belt tightening to satisfy investors. They're investing in technology that could potentially displace human labor, and they're pulling back from commitments, as we talked about, around sustainability and diversity. Far from discouraging workers, I believe this will continue to motivate many of them to organize. And that's in part because the factors that have led workers to mobilize in ever greater numbers have been building over time. Social media puts more organizing tools at their fingertips. They can really increasingly see and feel the ways they are on the front lines of these massive transformations that we've talked about, like climate and AI. The pandemic obviously laid bare both workers' precarity and also their opportunities to build power and make their voices heard. And Gen Z, I think, is particularly kind of powerful and a catalyst on that front. And the public sentiment around worker rights and labor unions is at its highest level in decades. And I would also say that, the act of organizing is really an act of investing in your workplace. And so it actually tracks with this idea that employees trust their workplaces more than other institutions, because the act of organizing is the act of trying to make your workplace better and really putting yourself on the line to do that rather than walking away. So if employers go back on their commitments or actively undermine organizing, arguably more now than ever before, they really risk permanently disenchanting their workforce and irreparably harming their brands. So instead, I recommend that companies embrace ways for workers to have a meaningful seat at the table. And I would argue that leading an organized workforce or leading as if your workforce is organized may well become the critical leadership skill of the next decade.
Yeah, and actually we're getting quite a few questions in now. And just following on from what you said there, Liba, as we prepare for election season in the US, how can companies build optimism for employees while walking a line of not telling them how to participate in civic engagement? I don't know who'd like to take that. Felicia, would you like to take that?
I think it goes back to this idea of agency and power that we're seeing in this data. Again, to some of what Liba was just saying, giving employees this opportunity to be civil, giving them a space to be civil and engage in the way that they would like to. That doesn't mean the organization needs to take a position. That means the organization creates the space for employees to think together, to ideate together, to think about the impact they want to have together. What we're clearly seeing in this data, again, is that employees really want to see their employer as a partner in this journey to be self-determined, and that includes them as a collective. So that's a way that employers can contribute to this desire from employees without taking a political position. It's really about creating community and giving employees that power to do so.
And Ali, I wanted to bring you back in because in your book, you talk about how to bring people together and remedy polarization. And you have a phrase, the need for the grit in the oyster of diversity, which I think is really important. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, and I think just before I go on to that, sometimes it's important for organizations not just to remedy polarizations, but to prevent it getting worse, right? And that's one of the really critical things that workplaces could do, where, if I'm honest, I've not always seen them stepping up to the plate and trying to enforce, to build on the points we've just heard, like, what are the norms of behavior in terms of how you engage? How can they set those patterns that people can pick up? How can they make sure people meet people and employees from other world views so that they can try and understand what's going on, maybe through mediated spaces where they've got other things in common to start with? That's such a powerful thing that organizations can do that I often see that they are not doing. But I think, there's been a lot of pushback on DEI, particularly in the US, or a lot of very vocal pushback, let's be more specific here. And actually, you're seeing most people starting to hold firm against that and instead start to expand a bit more about how they think about DEI. And that's where this grit in the oyster really can come in. So how comfortable are you listening to viewpoints that are very challenging? What happens to people in your organization that raise that? Do you value them? Do you promote them? What do you do? And some of the really exceptional and unfortunately also unusual cases that I see are leaders who, for example, are trying to track the career paths of people who speak out. And I think that's one very practical thing that people could start to look at and think about, how they expand and consider DEI and how they welcome that grit in the oyster.
Thanks, Ali. And in fact, we've got a really interesting question that kind of follows on from what you're saying. I run an internal comms agency that helps organizations improve communication with employees. This report seems to clearly call for increasing listening. Given the data, what are some of the other things we could consider doing differently? Karin, would you like to take that?
Sure. One of the things that we see is an action readiness gap, particularly when you look at the skilling, the up and reskilling piece. And I think Richard alluded to it, that most people, most employees, they understand that there's a need for them to continuously up and reskill themselves, so that need for lifelong learning, but they don't know in which direction to go. They don't know necessarily what skills they are missing and what are the skills that will help them remain in employment as the labor market changes so dramatically these days. So I think there's a very clear responsibility for employers to provide this career guidance to their employees to really show what are the different career trajectories that they can take. Are their skills worth in the labor market today? How bankable are they? But then also, what are different career paths they can then take for the way forward? And I think that's where we often see organizations currently falling short, because they often themselves don't necessarily connect all the different elements of their strategies. If you look at the climate piece, many companies have very clear plans on how to move forward on the climate side, but they don't connect it with the human capital strategies that they have. So they don't have a deeper understanding as to what are the skills that they need in order to make that happen. How do they up and reskill their employees into these jobs of the future? And then how do they support people in jobs that may no longer exist going forward because of these transition. And whether that is because of climate or AI, I think these are the same principles. So it is, how can employers take more accountability to support and be more transparent as to how careers can evolve and how they support their employees on that journey.
Thank you. And I wanted to bring in Liebe here. You know, we've talked a bit about how companies have to deliver on sustainable employment, but how have you seen companies address the need for workers' sense of agency and impact? I guess that follows on from the listening piece earlier.
Exactly. And I just want to double click on listening. I was looking into the data a little bit, and the Edelman team can correct me if I'm wrong, but I understand that about half of the associates who are surveyed in this research are not salaried. They're paid on an hourly basis. And just as an example of where listening, I think, becomes really important, it's very easy for salaried managers and leadership to overlook the fact that last minute changes in scheduling or income that's variable and volatile from month to month over the course of the year can be hugely disruptive for an hourly worker and for their families. And so if board and management are not attuned to these dynamics, you will just never be able to bridge that optimism gap. But beyond listening, and I would just say that, you know, unions in their best form, and they are not always operational in that way, but in their best form, they can be a really strong mechanism for facilitating this kind of listening, and also for these other areas that we're concerned about there, for adjudicating grievances, for in fact administering benefits and upskilling, whether it's, you know, healthcare that employees care so much about, or training and upskilling for new jobs and technologies. And they can actually build trust by enshrining this sort of mutual trust and employers' commitments to their employees and values into a contract that includes oversight and accountability on both sides. Now, in a non-unionized workplace, there are ways to approximate some of these impacts around listening, shared decision-making, and accountability. There are joint labor management committees that can advise on issues like health and safety, DEI, technological innovation. I think one great example in the US is Microsoft, who is currently really at the forefront pioneering processes that incorporate worker voice into the company's development and deployment of artificial intelligence. In this case, Microsoft actually chose to do this work in partnership with a coalition of US unions, even though a pretty minuscule percentage of Microsoft's US workforce is represented by a union. So just as an example of where unions, I think, can be great partners. And of course, I should mention that some companies are largely owned by their employees, and some operate very successfully with worker elected representation on their boards of directors. In the US, we have the largest worker-owned company is Public Supermarket, which has 250,000 employees. And of course, Silicon Valley has baked in profit sharing and other forms of employee ownership into its industry culture for decades. We're not necessarily seeing that expand into other parts of the economy where it could, you know, really add value. In terms of board level worker representation, that's more common across Europe, where places like Germany have systems of co-determination, and companies are actually mandated to have worker representation on their boards. But in the US, there are tech companies who are starting to experiment with this level of representation. I work with one called Honeycomb, and this is actually a policy that's attracting bipartisan support. So structures like these in which workers or their representatives have a real concrete stake in the success of the company and in its oversight can be really powerful ways to help bridge divides between workers and management.
Thank you. We've got an interesting question I was going to put to you, Ali, first about the intergenerational part of this that we haven't touched on yet. What insights can you add regarding long-term or generational trends in the degree to which an individual's job, such as income and reward, meets their life goals and expectations, family well-being, etc.? You know, how valuable is a snapshot view compared with longer-term generational changes? So we were seeing that older workers were less optimistic. How are you seeing things, Ali?
Yeah, well, I mean, that to me is one of the most intriguing aspects of this finding, because that runs slightly counter to some other things that you pick up, which is typically that younger people are less trusting of institutions. They still retain faith in sort of broader systems, but their own experience of institutions mean that they trust them less. Now, that research generally within political science has not gone into the depth that this has on how people feel in regards to their employers and that relationship between associates and with management. And I think that's one thing that I'd really be interested in hearing more about, and where I think there's space for Edelman and for people on this call to do more thought leadership work, because that's slightly surprising to me. Not that I think that it's not true, but there's a lot for young people to feel slightly depressed and uncertain about in the world at the minute, to be honest with you. And if there's reasons that they're feeling against that and the workplace could be key to unlocking it, that feels such an important thing to pick up and do more with, that really needs to be dug into further than has been so far.
Felicia, did you want to come in on that from an Edelman point of view? Is there more to be said about younger people and older people?
I'll say that the younger generation is highly influential. In some other trust research we did, 92% across generations said they had been influenced by the thinking of the youngest generation in the workforce, Gen Z. So they're very influential. This idea of optimism can be contagious if organizations put the right structures in place and do some of the things that we're talking about on this panel today. And also, I want to mention, just based on what Ali said earlier about fairness and how if it's not perceived, it can be destructive to an organization, and what Liba was talking about in terms of listening. It's really important for us as leaders to think about how we're seeing things versus how the associates or the workers are seeing things. More specifically, what I mean by that is leaders tend to be very focused on distributive justice, meaning access to training and opportunities is fairly distributed. But workers tend to be more focused on procedural justice, meaning I was part of the process and the procedure to get to the decision to whatever is happening. So sometimes, even if the outcome isn't necessarily what the worker wanted, or they want to continue to work towards something different, just being part of the procedure and process can increase that sense of fairness and increase the feeling that they were listened to and that they were part of the process and therefore have more power and agency, which can increase their optimism and close this gap.
That's great, yeah, because and actually I wanted to read another question that's come in that follows on really well from that. Do the panel feel that enough employers sufficiently walk the talk on the compensation aspect of these issues? We tell our young associates, including new recruits, that managing complex organizations is a team sport. Yet we continue to escalate the relative rewards for CEOs and most senior executives without differentiating between truly transformative managers and those who are just maintaining. Does this phenomenon need a remedy? I don't know who would like to come in on that first. That's a great question, I think. Karen, I'm going to pick on you.
Sure. I think the question of wages comes up repeatedly, and I think that is one of the key factors as well, where you see the polarization within the labor market. And there was just a recent study in the US that showed that I think 44% of Americans don't earn enough to actually afford a decent wage, a decent living for their families as well. So I do think we need to rethink the way that we remunerate people and the work that they do. We've seen it particularly also in COVID, where during COVID, where most of the frontline workers that bore the brunt of the impact and were really sort of at the forefront of fighting it, were not really protected as they should have. So I think it also leads to the fact that there is a need for a new social contract, right? I think the old structures to organize the labor market, they're no longer adequate. And COVID has just exacerbated that. So that's where we need to come together and be much clearer about what are the responsibilities and the expectations of all the different labor market actors, particularly also around the topic of wages. But I think we often see it more that this is something that really needs to be negotiated also between all the labor market actors. So it's governments coming together with employers, coming together with employee representatives. As Liba has also mentioned, I think the ILO, the International Labour Organization, is obviously one of the key fora for that. I don't think it should necessarily be upon every single organization to figure that out themselves, but how can we really collaborate and collaboratively move that conversation forward in a very constructive and meaningful way?
Liba, I'd really like to hear from you on this as well.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that this question of executive compensation and the perception that it is unfair actually helps to explain some of the gap that we're looking at, right? I mean, in the U.S., objectively, economic inequality is actually starting to decrease. You have like pretty good economic indicators in lots of parts of the economy, and yet the experience of being a worker in the U.S. Paints a really different picture. And I think I think that's what we're looking at in organizations as well. You could have, from a board perspective, what seems like a fair system of compensating a CEO, but to an associate, if that gap is increasing, and if they're not feeling like they're part of the process, that they're being compensated fairly, their outlook and their optimism is going to really suffer, and the internal dynamics are really going to suffer. So I think that perception really matters, and the transparency and the access, to Felicia's point, that workers have to being part of the process is going to go a long way toward bridging that gap.
If I can just add one interesting example from that. So I'm based in Switzerland, and we're obviously that country that votes on anything and everything. And a few years ago, we actually had a popular initiative to limit the wage of the most senior person within the organization to 12 times of that of the lowest paid worker. And actually, the Swiss population voted against it. So it wasn't accepted. Just sort of recognizing that, yes, there is, or the leadership positions come with an increased responsibility, that it might be difficult to really put a number behind how much more they should earn, that it should be driven by the market. But then also it was driven by the fear that then a lot of the lower paid jobs might either be outsourced to other companies and to countries abroad, or that then sort of new structures would be found just sort of to keep that system in place. So I think these are some interesting dynamics that should also not be overlooked when we talk about the topic of wages and who should or could earn what.
Great. So another question from the audience. What are the biggest threats and opportunities you see for multinational organizations to increase workforce optimism? How can employer branding best support here? Felicia, I'm going to come to you for that first.
I think some of the biggest opportunities for multinational corporations is really understanding the effect of local culture and its effect on workplace culture and how people perceive what's happening in the workplace. Part of our identity, how we think about things, how we receive information and process it, is who we are and where we've come from. So we've done work with a lot of multinational corporations who have gone further in understanding the culture and the implications of that culture on worker beliefs and behaviors across their portfolio and across their companies' footprint. And then to the point of employer branding, thinking about what are the core values and behaviors we can bring forward as an organization to unify people around behaviors, no matter where they have come from, because we know from doing the research within our organization and engaging with our employees that these are the values and these are the behaviors that are going to, as a collective, help us get to where we want to be.
Thank you. And I wanted to bring it down to sort of very grassroots level. Ali, I had a question I had written down myself to ask you about the power of storytelling. You know, misinformation is very sticky, as we say, and has contributed to polarization. You know, could you share with us some ideas on how storytelling could be used to generate more togetherness in our workplaces? It sounds really basic, but it seems to be at the heart of almost everything.
Yeah, it really is. And I think I just wanted to pick up on something that Liebe and Felicia were saying about, you know, perceptions. And in polarized time, perceptions can become actually even more important than what's happening. And who you rely on to help shape those perceptions will increasingly become people like you. So this gap between who people went for, which the research identified, whether associates increasingly going to other associates and executives increasingly going to other executives, I'm not surprised that phenomenon is playing out, but there's really important steps that they've both begun to outline about, you know, what can you do to try and help bridge that and stop your brain working in that way where you just rely on, you know, information from people like you, to be honest. And I spend a lot of time talking to senior executives who think that they're not affected by this phenomenon. And breaking news, unfortunately, you are. In fact, in some cases, you particularly are. And if you look again at the research, I'll get back to your question with a practical idea in a minute. If you look at the research about about how many executives are driven to join organizations or potentially leave organizations because of politics, you can see that sort of political identity is probably even more likely to play a role for leaders than it is elsewhere. But I do think there's some things in storytelling and how people understand stories that organizations could do at scale that they're really not. So there's this concept called inoculation theory, which helps people identify fake news, for example, where there's a lot of work that I think in, for example, the run up to COVID, or particularly in the run up to elections, where people could use like small amounts of fake news, often in a humorous way, to try and help people become better at spotting it. And if you can improve that information hygiene, then you're actually starting to help people bridge divides and to tell and understand better stories. And I think there's a lot of really powerful examples like that that organizations are currently missing out on, that are very easy ways to stop divides worsening or indeed to bridge them together.
Does anyone else want to come in on, effective tactics to bridge divides as we head into the election? No. Okay, I'll move on.
Because it's really hard.
It's really hard.
As well, like it's really easy to divide and much tougher to bring people together. And often there could be a marketing case for dividing as well.
Yes.
I would just say, and I think this links to the kind of civic engagement question before. I think there is a really important role that employers play as engines of democracy and as environments in which citizens, members of society get to kind of exercise the muscles that make society and democracy stronger. So we're talking a lot about social ties and trust and connecting across difference. And I think even beyond that, employers can play a role in connecting folks to practical civic engagement opportunities. In the US, I think in the face of an increased demand for companies to weigh in on specific issues and some fears around doing that, there is, I think, long overdue more engagement from employers in just the voting process, voting education, poll working, these kind of nonpartisan pieces of the democratic system that I think employers can be a really important engine for, that are not in any way partisan and don't require kind of telling folks how to vote or what to think.
Richard, did you want to come in?
I think we as employers have to fight against the increasing returns to distrust. And that means we have to give people facts. We have to show people that, in fact, positive things are happening. Use the power of your employee newsletters as the most credible source of information to give facts that enable proper decisions. And again, I think all of those help to disincentivize use of distrust, and both on left and the right.
Thank you. And I just have one more question here. I'm going to put this one to Karen. We haven't talked so much about future-facing skills as a way to help workforces feel more optimistic about the future. What's the role of embedding skills in the workforce in bringing people together, one, but also, uniting the workforce for an AI-powered future?
I mean, we know that up and reskilling is critical. And what I would love to see is if companies were to invest as much in people as they do in tech. I think one of the challenges that we see is that from a balance sheet perspective, investments in people are still treated as a cost and not actually an investment, which then obviously makes it less interesting for organizations to do that if they still treat people as a cost rather than an asset. So I think it's there again, the collaboration also with governments in terms of how do we define also new training and work-based learning programs to bring more people in. And again, it's also around the career guidance piece. I think that's something that we really can't emphasize enough, that we make sure that we up and reskill people into employment, and not just for the sake of it, but it really is with that longer term perspective as to where are jobs being created, and then what are the skills that people need in order to move in that direction.
Thank you. I wanted just to close off by asking each of the panelists if there's one thing they'd like the audience to take away from this report and the findings. I'm going to start with you, Liva.
Yeah, I think this issue of procedural justice, I really like that frame as a way to talk about what empowerment actually means. We need systems in our workplace that allow workers to be part of the process of determining what their work consists of and what the conditions of their workplace look like. And I think that will go a long way.
Thank you. Ali?
Yeah, I think I'd double down on uncertainty and the consequences of uncertainty, and that can be around sustainable employment or the broader economic environment, and actually how trying to give, employers can try and provide an increasing firmness to where people are, and that will be very critical in helping trying to bridge divides when they go, and that's often underused. So you can look at that obviously through a sustainable employment lens, and should it be a human right and all of those things, but there is also much more to it that people should bring into giving certainty to employees.
Great, thank you. Felicia?
Yes, people need to feel a sense of contribution. And with COVID, I think it shifted, or for a moment, dislodged the focus on work as being necessarily that way of contribution. People can have that sense of contribution in different ways in their lives. So that ratio used to be more predominantly about work. For many people, that has shifted to be more about community, about family, et cetera. This data is telling us that we have a real opportunity at this moment as people reconsider their ratios and how they want to use their time and energy to get that sense of contribution. This is our opportunity to, again, make the workplace the place that they get that sense of contribution. But it's up to us to make the changes we're talking about for that to occur.
Thank you. Last word to you, Karen.
What we often say is, that people are resistant to change, but I don't think that's generally true. I think they're resistant to loss. They're resistant to unpredictability and to uncertainty. So I think that's where organizations and employers, and particularly leaders, need to take much more ownership to build the transparency, the information flows, listen, not just for the sake of it, but listen to understand, and then act upon it in a meaningful and credible and particularly also consistent way.
Thank you. Thank you to all the panel. That was a wonderful discussion. I'm going to hand back to Richard for closing remarks.
We've told you something very profound today, that the mass-class divide within the corporation is larger than it is in the general society. That is a cry from the heart from the people who are in the bottom part of the workplace. They are not happy about their economic prospects for the next 5 years. And at the same time, they're probably watching the rebalancing of stakeholders by the company. They're watching carefully that it's the consumer or the investor or the regulator. And so all the attention that was paid to the employee post-COVID is sort of moving backwards. What I would say specifically about this is, if you're going back to your bosses about recommendations, you can avoid being a political advocate, but still speak internally, passionately about these issues and make the change that's important for your company and for society. You don't have to be a big voice, except within your four walls, but do things that make change. Second, tell people the truth about jobs. Tell them the truth about AI. Make it clear that if they want to be part of the future, they must be upskilled, and that you're prepared to help them do this. And third, show that there's value to being optimistic, that it's not just hope, that it's actually possible, and that we can actually together do this, because we need people leaning in. We don't want them to be workaholics. We want them to have a good life, but we want them to advocate for us, stay with the company, and be positive on social. And if we do that, then we're going to come to a much better outcome in the workplace. I'm deeply appreciative to Sydney, to Tonya Reese, and to our IP team, and to this brilliant panel. We've told you something important today. Now let's go do it. Thank you.